It was just a normal day in the village when all of a sudden everything changed as the blood golem was born. This is the story. It all begins just over 500 years ago in just an ordinary village by the ocean. Now everyone was happy there in that village as food was abundant, the houses were warm, and the vast oceans provided jobs for all the villagers. So really, they were a thriving civilization. But then, one day, everything would change. As one day, during the picturesque sunrise that the village would experience every morning, something was spotted in the distance. Now, at first, it just looked like a set of small brown dots in the distance. However, when it got closer and closer, the villagers grew more and more concerned and terrified, as they all began to run out of their houses, screaming, attempting to warn everyone else of the dangers that they were facing. As the small brown dots, well, that was a fleet of 1,000 illagers, and they were heading right for them. Now, this was bad, very bad, as the villagers just had nowhere to go, as their boats were slower than the illagers, so they couldn't outpace them in the ocean. And well, their village was on an island, so they had nowhere to run. They were doomed. So really, all they could do was to just try and hide in their homes and hope and pray that the illagers just leave them alone and pass them by. However, unluckily, their hopes and dreams would fall flat as the illagers just minutes later arrived on the beaches of that island. And together, they began to invade that village. Now, normally, the Iron Golem would have been able to slow down this attack, but not this time, because as soon as the evokers arrived on those beaches, they threw strange potions at the Golem, which put him to sleep instantly. And so with the Golem unable to prevent the progression of the attacks, the illagers, just seconds later, were able to make their way right into the center of the village. However, this time, during that raid, they didn't kill a single villager. Well, not yet anyways. Instead, they threw more of those strange potions at them, which caused all of the villagers to black out. Several days passed when their consciousness finally returned. But when that happened, they all realized that they were no longer in their home village. No, instead they were all crammed into a cage, and the Iron Golem was asleep just below them. And so, when all the villagers began to realize this, then they all began to scream out for help. But really, no help was coming. Instead, the evokers arrived, and the evokers all began to perform a ritual of sorts around that cage. And so with that, the room turned red, blood red, and everything began to shake. This seemed wrong, all wrong, but there was nothing that the villagers could do, as they were trapped. But luckily, just a few minutes later, the floor on the villager's cage was dropped, and so they were freed. Well, not quite, as all the villagers fell to their deaths. But the story does not quite end just yet, as the evokers continue to perform this ritual even after all the villagers were dead, as now the Iron Golem was being coated in the blood of the dead villagers he once swore to protect. It was a gruesome sight to behold, and thus it was merely just seconds later when the Iron Golem began to glow in a dark red you, as the blood of the villagers was beginning to transfuse into his metallic casing, and he was glowing now as he was receiving powers from that demonic ritual, as he was becoming the Blood Golem. Yes, this was it. The Illagers thought they were finally going to have the most powerful golem in the universe, and the villagers would be annihilated once they release him onto the world. This was great. The Illagers were finally going to rule the world. However, the Illagers were unable to complete that ritual, as the Blood Golem was suddenly awoken, and he was filled with rage, as he was fully aware of what was happening around him the entire time. And as the evokers hadn't got to the part in that ritual where they would be able to control the Blood Golem, he was still loyal to the villagers, and thus the Blood Golem ripped his way out of that cage, and he charged right at those evil spellcasters, and in just one punch he was able to kill every single one of them. And then he fled. Now, all the other Illagers from across that mansion did try and chase after him, but due to that ritual, the Blood Golem was granted with super speed, and thus he was able to run faster than any of the Illagers could possibly go, even with the use of a horse. And so the Blood Golem just continued to run for the next few hours, not stopping. But when he finally felt safe, then he stopped, and then he just stood there, as he was just trying to take in what had just happened, as really all of this was just so strange, and he couldn't believe that he was now the Blood Golem. And so he stood there for the next few hours, contemplating what he needed to do next. And well, over that time, he decided that since he had all these new powers and had just become so powerful now, that he should be the one who goes into woodland mansions and kills all those evil Illagers. And thus, he could save the lives of countless villagers. Yes, that was a great idea, he thought, and he knew he had to do it, as he owed it to the villagers to help them, especially since he failed to protect those villagers from his home village. And so with that in mind, he began to walk onwards, ready to start this fight. However, his ambition for revenge blinded him from the fact that he was standing on a mountaintop, and thus he just walked right off it. Oh no, this was bad, and so the Blood Golem tried to reach his arms up to try and grab onto the ledge of the cliff, but it didn't work. Instead, something very strange happened, as somehow he teleported upwards. But it just didn't matter, as even though he could teleport now, he wasn't able to teleport high enough to stand back on that ledge. And so for that reason, he just began to fall again. But it was okay though, as he could just try to teleport again and be saved. Right? Well, no, he couldn't do that, as there was a cooldown on that power of teleportation, and so he just began to fall once again. This was annoying. He had just been granted with all these great powers, and was given the opportunity to save the lives of millions, if not billions, of villagers. But now he was just going to die due to his own stupidity. Or maybe not, as just when the Blood Golem was merely blocks away from colliding with the solid stone floor, he started to spin his head around, trying to take in what would very likely be his final sight of this world. However, as he did that, he discovered one of his other powers, that being his ability to transform into a shadow. And thus with that, he was saved. And so after spending a few minutes in that strange shadow form, he spun his head around again, and thankfully, he was able to return to his ordinary state of being. And so it would be over the next few years that he, the Blood Golem, would travel the world across its vast oceans, under its darkest caves, and over snowy mountains, all so that he could find woodland mansions. And well, once he would eventually find one, he would enter it, and then over the next few hours, he would kill every single illager that resided there, using all of his powers to aid him in this victory. And then, after that, he would burn the mansion down to the ground, just to ensure that if some illager had hidden away from him within that mansion, they too would perish, and any of the resources that the illagers had stored within that mansion were gone forever. And then, after doing that, he would move on to the next mansion, and the next one, and the next, and the next, and the next, and so on. And thus it would be, over those next few decades, that the Blood Golem was able to kill hundreds of thousands of those evil illagers. And thus, he was able to save the lives of millions, if not billions, of villagers. And the Blood Golem couldn't have been more proud of his work. And well, the villagers were starting to notice this, as they were beginning to see a drop-off in the number of raids that they were receiving. Yet, they were confused as to why that was the case, as none of the villagers, up until this point, had actually ever seen the Blood Golem. And so this sudden decrease in raids just didn't make any sense. But very soon, that would change, as it was on one dark rainy night that the Blood Golem approached yet another normal woodland mansion. Or so it seemed, as this mansion was different to all others, as this particular mansion had 15 villagers trapped in cages deep within the heart of the building. And so the Blood Golem, as usual, cleared out that mansion by killing every one of those demonic monsters that he could find. But then, as he was walking along the corridor of that mansion, he came across those villagers within that prison. And well, at the first sight of them, he didn't hesitate, and he released them, just happy to know that he was saving them. Now, all the villagers were very confused, as they'd never seen this strange Blood Golem before, and so they didn't know who he was or why he was helping them. However, before they could ask any questions, he just disappeared into the shadows, and was never seen again by those villagers. And so once he was gone, all those villagers just ran out of that mansion as fast as they possibly could, and they went home, where they then told everyone in those villages about this strange Blood Golem that had saved their lives. Now at first, very few of the villagers believed this story. However, as all 15 of them were saying the exact same thing, and the fact that they were somehow all still alive after being taken by the illagers, when really they should have been killed already, made many of the villagers reconsider their final decision. And thus, it didn't take too long before everyone in that village believed in this strange Blood Golem. And so, after that, legends were spread of him all over the world to villagers everywhere. But once again, everyone was very skeptical, as it just sounded insane to many of the villagers that there could be such a being in the world. However, as over the next few years, more and more villagers came forward whom were really meant to be dead, stating how this strange Blood Golem had saved them. Many villagers began to believe that the Blood Golem was real, as there was just no way that all these different villagers could be making up the exact same story. And so, the Blood Golem just had to exist. In fact, many villagers even went a step beyond this, as many of them began to look up and admire the Blood Golem, to the point where many of them even started to worship him, as they would then create small monuments of redstone golems in honor of the blood golem, as they just felt so grateful for the blood golem, as he really was, to many villagers, their saving grace within their lives. And so, over time, all the villagers would come to know very well of this blood golem, and soon they would all love him and his work. And so, all was good in the world, as the villagers were being saved by the blood golem, and the blood golem was getting more and more recognition and praise. But soon, once again, everything would change, as it was on yet another dark, rainy night that a group of powerful evokers ambushed the blood golem as he was travelling through the barren desert. Now the blood golem was used to fighting many evokers at once, and so he was ready to fight and kill these ambushers. And so he lunged into an attack. However, before he could hit any of them, he was hit once again by that strange potion. And thus, with that, he was put to sleep instantly. When he awoke a few days later, he was in pain, so much pain, as he was once again in a cage, and the evokers were performing that exact same ritual on him. And so, just like before, the room was red, blood red, and everything was shaking. However, the evokers didn't realize that the blood golem already had the ability to transform into a shadow. And so for that reason, they didn't put up any preventative measures to stop him from doing that. And thus, the blood golem was able to escape that cage with relative ease. Now the evokers saw this happening, and they were shocked, as they couldn't believe that he could do that. And so they all tried to run after him, so that they could splash him with that sleeping potion again, and thus could continue their demonic ritual. But the blood golem was just going way too fast, and so the evokers were unable to catch up to him. However, they were able to shoot one tipped arrow at him, a tipped arrow that was infused with a potion that would track him down. Yes, this was it, the evokers thought. There was no escaping now. They will get him eventually. Now, the blood golem saw this, but he just continued to run, as he just wanted to save himself right now and deal with that tracker later. And so he continued to run and run and run for several days straight, until he ended up in a beautiful mountain range. Now normally this would have been great, but this time it wasn't, as it was freezing outside, as this mountain range was experiencing the most extreme snowstorm that he had ever seen. But still, he knew he had to go into the mountain range, because he knew that the illagers were chasing after him, and thus this might be his only opportunity to save himself. And so he ran straight into it. However, the plummeting temperatures were killing him, as his internal wiring was beginning to freeze, and thus he was dying. And thus, knowing that, the blood golem was forced to hide in a cave for warmth and security. And so he just had to stand there in that cave, anxiously waiting for the storm to be over, so that he could continue running and get help removing that tracker. But as he was doing that, all of a sudden, that cave collapsed. And so the blood golem went immediately into shadow mode, and is saved for the most part. But then something happened that would change his life forever, as he saw a villager whom was also hiding in that cave. But they were dying, as they were being killed by the hypothermia of being covered in powdered snow when that cave collapsed. The blood golem didn't know what to do. He wanted to save them, but there was nothing he could do, and so he just had to float there as a shadow, watching that villager suffer. The blood golem was filled with sorrow and sadness. He knew that villager was going to die, and he was just there, watching it. He had to do something, and so he thought and thought about it, and then just a few seconds later, he very luckily came up with an idea. As maybe he could give his life force to that villager and could save him. As after all, he knew that he was doomed, with the illagers chasing him, so why not try to save this life? There was nothing to lose from it. And so the blood golem began to selflessly donate his soul and life force to that villager. However, he was too slow, as by the time that he had given up his life force to that villager, he was already dead. But wait, not all hope was lost just yet, as his life force and powers were beginning to attach onto something. It was the villager's soul, and so with that, he was saved. But if you want to know what happened next, then you'll need to watch this video.